I want to start with a number I sat with for almost 2 years before I felt I could put it in a video. 500. That is the size of the Okinawan centenarian cohort, the team I have worked with for the last 3 decades first, under Dr. Makoto Suzuki at Ryukyu University. Then, with my brother Craig and the Pacific Health Research Institute has now followed long enough to say something useful about dietary records, in some cases, for the last 50 years of their lives. When you start a study like that, you go in with a hypothesis. You think you are looking for the one food, the miracle vegetable, something that will come up in the records again and again and bend the survival curve. I want to tell you what we actually found, because it surprised even Suzuki, who had been on the ground in Okinawa since 1975. It was not one food, it was 3, and they did not work on the same organ. The 500 Okinawans who reached 100 all ate, in some form, every single day, goya, bitter melon, yomogi, Japanese mugwort, and gobo, burdock root. And the reason was not a shared anti-inflammatory pathway or any single tidy mechanism the supplement industry could repackage. The reason was that each one quietly regulated a different organ system. Goya the pancreas, gobo the barrier of the intestine. The survival benefit came from the simultaneous, low-grade regulation of 3 organs for 80 straight years. I'm going to come back to that phrase, tri-organ regulation, in about 15 minutes, because I want to earn it. For now, hold 3 names. Kame Ogido, the farmer. Shiryu Toguchi, the gardener. Shigeko Yamashiro, the weaver. All 3 from Ogimi village. All 3 more than 100 years old when we sat in their kitchens. All 3, every single day, ate these same 3 foods. Subscribe so the next one lands on Tuesday. Let us begin. 500 dietary records is a number that does not sound impressive until you understand what it costs to collect them. A dietary record in our cohort is not a food frequency questionnaire. The standard questionnaire, as anyone who has tried to use one in an elderly population knows, is a blunt instrument. People forget, people answer what they think the researcher wants. What we did instead, starting under Suzuki and continuing through the work Craig and I have done since the mid-90s, was sit in kitchens. We sat across from the centenarians in their own houses, 2 to 4 times a year, and watched them prepare a meal. We weighed the gobo. We photographed the bowl on the table. We wrote down what came back to the sink uneaten. We did this for 20, 30, in a few cases 40 consecutive years. When you do that with 500 people, a pattern emerges that no questionnaire would surface. The pattern is not the dramatic food. It is the food that shows up on a Monday and again Tuesday and again Wednesday and is so unremarkable the centenarian does not even mention it when you ask what they eat. That food, in our records, was goya, and yomogi, and gobo. A note on what we excluded, because I owe the senior audience that honesty. We excluded anyone who had moved away from Ojimi for more than 3 consecutive years in adulthood. We excluded anyone whose primary informant was a grandchild or an aide rather than the centenarian themselves. The 500 I am talking about are the 500 who stayed in the village, ate from the village garden, and named what was in the bowl while still mentally sharp. That is a high bar. It is also the right bar. The first kitchen I want you in is Kame Ogido's. Kame was 104 when we sat in her kitchen for the 3rd time. Small coral stone house on the eastern edge of Ogimi, tin roof, a wooden door that did not quite close. Behind the house, a 30 square meter garden where every spring she grew 1 climbing vine of Goya Momordica charantia, a pale green, ridged, almost reptilian-looking cucurbit, extraordinarily bitter. She picked 1 small goya every other morning, May to October, sliced lengthwise. Seeds and pith scooped out with the back of a spoon. Salt rested 10 minutes on a flat plate. Drained. Blanched 30 seconds in boiling water. Drained again. Then stir-fried with tofu and a little sesame oil and a little tamari in an iron skillet. That is goya champuru. Kame ate some version of it almost every day for the last 80 years of her life. What is in the bitter melon? Charantin, a steroidal saponin mixture. Momorticin, a cucurbitane, type triterpenoid, and polypeptide, P, an insulin mimetic peptide. Mechanistically, this triad increases GLUT, 4-glucose transporter translocation, to muscle and fat cell membranes, activates AMP-activated protein kinase, AMPK, the cell's internal fuel sensor, and protects pancreatic beta cells from oxidative stress. I want to be careful here. The supplement industry has sold bitter melon extract pills for 2 decades, and the human trial evidence is more modest than the marketing. Wang and colleagues, Journal of Ethnopharmacology, 2017, pooled 7 RCTs of bitter melon extract in type 2 diabetes and found an HbA1c reduction of 0.22 to 0.5%, real, statistically significant. Not metformin, more like a quarter of metformin. But pooled trials never measure what 80 consecutive years of half a goya a day does to a pancreas that was never asked to spike insulin in the first place. Kameo Jido, at 102, had a fasting glucose of 91 mg, DL. Her beta cell function, by the indirect measures we could take in a village screening, was indistinguishable from a woman in her 60s. She had never been diagnosed with diabetes. She did not own a glucometer. AMPK is the kitchen thermostat. Goya, every other day for 80 years, taps the thermostat. Just a tap. The pancreas does not have to send out an alarm of insulin. The system stays in the comfortable range, day after day, decade after decade. When Suzuki and I pulled the goya frequency variable against diabetes diagnosis, the centenarians in our 500 had a documented type 2 diabetes rate under 6%. The American comparison group, age 75 and over, runs above 25%. That is goya, that is the first food, that is the pancreas. The second kitchen is 2 kilometers up the hillside, in the upland fields above Ogimi, where Saryu Toguchi grew his vegetables. Toguchi was 103 when Craig and I sat with him under the eaves of his garden shed. He picked one wild herb by the handful every spring: yomogi, Artemisia princeps, Japanese mugwort, a perennial in the daisy family. Village women pick the young leaves in March and April, blanch them, pound them into paste, and fold the paste into a rice flour dough to make kusamochi green mochi cakes. Toguchi ate kusamochi 2 or 3 times a week in spring, and through the rest of the year he steeped a small handful of dried yomogi in hot water for an infusion with breakfast. In his late 90s, Toguchi had a documented gastric upset, acute gastritis, on a Western chart. He was prescribed nothing. He resumed picking yomogi within the week. The recurrence did not return for 18 months. The active compound in yomogi is a methoxylated flavone called eupatolin, with a close cousin called jaciocidin. These are largely unique to Artemisia princeps and a few related species, not in spinach, not in kale. In this one wild herb, eupatolin upregulates mucin 5AC, the principal protective mucus glycoprotein lining the stomach. It suppresses loss of prostaglandin E2, which keeps gastric blood flow and the mucus layer intact. And it accelerates regeneration of the gastric epithelium after acidic or chemical insult, including the insult from common NSAIDs like aspirin and ibuprofen. This is not folk medicine evidence. Eupatolin is the active ingredient in a licensed South Korean pharmaceutical Stilin, DA9601, on the market since 2002 as a gastric mucosa protectant. The Stilin RCT showed endoscopic healing scores comparable to misoprostol, the synthetic prostaglandin analog used in American practice to prevent ulcers in patients on long-term NSAIDs. Misoprostol costs about 10 times what dried mugwort costs at H-Mart. Toguchi did not need to know any of that. He picked the leaves in March, put them in the dough, ate the green mochi, and his stomach lining stayed intact for 103 years. The stomach is a chamber lined with cells dying and being replaced every 3 to 5 days. The mucin layer is the wallpaper. Eupatolin is the gentle hand that smooths the wallpaper down twice a week. Not a renovation, a smoothing. For 100 years, that is yomogi. That is the second food. That is the stomach lining. The third kitchen belonged to Shigeko Yamashiro, 102 when we sat with her, still weaving banana fiber cloth bashofu on a small loom in the corner of her main room. Yamashiro had a backyard hedge, not a flower hedge, a row of plants her mother had set in the soil decades earlier that produced long, slender, dark brown roots she dug up every other week with a small hand spade. Burdock, gobo in Japanese, Arctium lapa. She made one dish almost every other day for the last 60 years of her life. Kinpira gobo. Roots scrubbed, but not peeled, shaved into long, thin matchsticks, soaked in cold water 5 minutes. To mellow the bitter, drained, then stir-fried with carrot and a piece of aburage tofu in a tiny amount of sesame oil with a splash of tamari. 5 minutes. A small bowl. Every other day, Yamashiro had documented stool regularity into her 102nd year. No history of constipation. No history of diverticular pain. Craig wrote a line in the margin after the third home visit, paraphrased, "No trouble in the belly for 50 years. Gobo is, by dry weight, 15 to 20% inulin-soluble fiber compounds called inulin-type fructans." Robert Freud's 2007 review in the Journal of Nutrition is the foundational paper. Inulin is not digested in the small intestine. It travels intact to the colon, where it is fermented preferentially by two genera of beneficial bacteria, Bifidobacterium and Faecalibacterium prausnitzi. The fermentation products are short-chain fatty acids acetate, propionate, and the one to remember tonight, butyrate. Butyrate is the preferred energy substrate of the colonocytes, the cells lining the colon. They do not run on glucose like most cells. They run on butyrate. And when butyrate is plentiful, the colonocytes upregulate two tight junction proteins called ZU1 and occludin, the molecular velcro that holds the cells of the gut lining tightly together and prevents the contents of the colon from leaking through into the bloodstream. The mechanism paper is Pong and colleagues, Journal of Nutrition, 2009. Akako, two-cell monolayer model showing butyrate enhances the intestinal barrier through AMPK activation and tight junction assembly. The same AMPK we talked about with Goya, the same internal fuel sensor, activated this time locally, in the gut lining, by a short-chain fatty acid produced when bacteria in your colon ferment a root that grew in a hedge in Ogimi village. The gut lining is a single layer of cells, the thickness of a sheet of writing paper, separating the inside of the colon, which is, in essence, the outside of your body from the bloodstream. When they loosen, what some clinicians call increased intestinal permeability, the small molecules cross over. The immune system recognizes them as foreign, and a quiet, decades-long inflammatory response begins that the cardiology literature now associates with atherosclerosis, the metabolic literature with insulin resistance, and the geriatrics literature increasingly with frailty. Butyrate, every other day for 60 years, kept Yamashiro's tight junctions tight. Sank. Reprise. Yamashiro at the loom. A digression. I want to stay in Yamashiro's main room for one more minute. Because I have rushed past something the field notes will not let me leave alone. The loom was a hip-supported backstrap loom, and Yamashiro at 102 was still weaving roughly 3 centimeters of cloth a day. 3 centimeters. Not a productive output. Not commercial. But it was the rhythm of her morning. She wove for about an hour and a half after breakfast, every day, in a posture that engaged her hip flexors, her core, her hands, her shoulders, and her cervical spine in a quiet, repeating cycle her body had performed for 90 years. I bring this up not to extend the food argument, but to be honest about what we did not separate, in our analysis, from what we did. Yamashiro's gut microbiome was not just being fed gobo 3 times a week. It was being fed gobo 3 times a week inside a body that moved gently and consistently in a way the average American senior body does not. We have not fully untangled, in the data, how much of the gut barrier integrity in our centenarians is the inulin and how much is the gentle, persistent abdominal motion of daily traditional work. My best guess, and I want to be clear that this is a guess, is that the food is the larger lever, but the movement is the multiplier. 3 centimeters of cloth a day for 90 years is not nothing. The senior audience watching this deserves to know what the data does and does not say. The 3 foods are real. The mechanisms are real. The survival difference is real. But Yamashiro at her loom is also real. And I am not going to pretend the loom did nothing for the bowl. Chh 5, bridge. What surprised us? Try organ regulation. The question we asked next was, what happened when one of the 3 foods was missing? We have a sub-cohort about 40 individuals who, for reasons of soil or season or preference, ate only 2 of the 3 foods consistently. We called them the 2 of 3 group. Controlling for caloric density, physical activity, and the basic confounders, the survival curve separated. Not dramatically, but meaningfully. The 3 of 3 group reached 100 at a documented rate, more than 50% higher than the 2 of 3 group. That is the moment the phrase "I want to revisit now" started to mean something. Try organ regulation. It is not the antioxidant content. It is not the polyphenol load. The numbers on those are unremarkable compared to a cup of green tea. What is unique to the trio is that each food quietly regulates a different organ system: pancreas, gastric mucosa, intestinal barrier, and the survival benefit comes from the simultaneous low-grade regulation of 3 organs for 80 consecutive years. No proton pump inhibitor does that. No single supplement on any shelf in any American pharmacy does that. Honestly, when I first read the survival curve coming out of that 2 of 3 versus 3 of 3 analysis, I did not believe it. I thought we had a confounder. I went back, with Craig, and pulled the physical activity records, the social network records, the income records, the smoking records. We controlled for everything we had data on. The signal held. At a certain point, you stop arguing with your own data. 1 page. Put it on the refrigerator. The bowl is Goya Yomogi Gobo Champuru. 2 servings, 25 minutes. $3.20 per serving at Winter. 2026 grocery prices. Ingredients: 1 small Goya to 150 g. 1 small piece of gobo to 80 g. Scrubbed. 1 small handful of fresh yomogi tips, 10 g, or 1 tsp dried mugwort, rehydrated 3 minutes in hot water. 200 g firm tofu. Drained, broken into pieces. 2 eggs lightly beaten vegan. 50 g extra tofu in place of eggs. 1 Telps toasted sesame oil. 1 Telps tamari or soy sauce. 1/2 teaspoon mirin optional. Goya prep, the bitter mitigation step. This is the one detail that determines whether you keep making the bowl. The bitterness is cucurbitacin, concentrated in the seed cavity and just under the skin. It is volatile and water-soluble. 1. Slice the Goya lengthwise. Scoop seeds and white pith out with the back of a spoon. Discard. 2. Salt rest 10 minutes on a flat plate with about 1/2 teaspoon fine salt. Osmosis pulls water out of the cells, and the cucurbitacin comes out with the water. 3. Rinse. Pat dry. 4. Blanch 30 seconds in boiling water. The cucurbitacin volatilizes off in the steam. The charentin we want is heat-stable for short durations and stays in the flesh. Result: to 70% less bitter, under 15% charentin loss, documented in the Korean food chemistry literature and in the Wang 2017 review. The bowl. Heat sesame oil in a wok over medium heat. Add gobo strips. First, they need the longest cooking. Stir 3 minutes. Add Goya slices. Stir 3 minutes. Add tofu gently. Stir 2 minutes. Add yomogi tips at the very end. Stir 30 seconds. Push everything to one side, pour the beaten eggs into the cleared space, scramble loosely, fold the eggs back through the vegetables. Splash in tamari and mirin, toss once. Off heat. The difference between a bowl that gets eaten tonight and a bowl that does not is logistics, not biology. Where do you get the 3 foods in the United States? H Mart. Korean-American chain, 95+ locations. Fresh Goya. Signed bitter melon or fugwa. In produce aisle 4. Fresh gobo, burdock root or yueyong. In root vegetables, seasonal. Dried yomogi. Korean suk, in the tea or dried herb aisle wong mugwort. About $4.99 for 2 ounces. A 6-month supply. Mitsuwa Marketplace. Japanese-American chain in LA, Chicago, New Jersey, Dallas. Same 3 ingredients year-round, plus frozen kusamochi in the freezer aisle. Whole Foods Market in a metro store with an Asian produce section. Fresh Goya year-round. Fresh gobo seasonally. Yomogi rarely fresh substitute dried mugwort from the tea aisle. Amazon. Dried Korean mugwort, Wang or Nara. $5, 7 für 2 Unze. Frozen sliced burdock from Frida's specialty produce, 12 ounces bag to $5. Frida's also packages frozen sliced bitter melon as a backup if fresh Goya is not within driving distance. Frozen is fine. Charentin holds through 6 months at -18 degrees Celsius. Inulin holds essentially indefinitely. Eupadolin in dried yomogi holds at least 2 years sealed. Senior safety notes. If you are on warfarin, Coumadin, yomogi contains vitamin K. Either hold consumption absolutely steady week to week so the INR stays predictable, or skip the yomogi and coordinate with the clinician who manages your INR. Do not start and stop. Variability is what causes the problem, not the herb. If you are on a sulfonylurea glipizide, glympyride, there is an additive hypoglycemic risk with goya. Start at a quarter portion, monitor fasting glucose for the first 2 weeks, coordinate with the prescriber. If you have diverticulosis or active inflammatory bowel disease, introduce gobo gradually 15 g a day for the first week, then 50 g every other day. Transient bloating in the first 10-14 days almost always subsides as the colonic microbiome adapts. If you have G6PD deficiency, more common in Mediterranean or Sephardi descent, discard the goya seed cavity completely. The flesh is safe. The seed cavity contains vicine. What to expect? Week 2, less sleepy in the late morning. AMPK-mediated improvement in muscle glucose disposal. Real, documented. Week 4, less heartburn on a typical day. If you are on aspirin or ibuprofen, less burning in the upper abdomen, eupatillin upregulating mucin, 5AC on a timeline that matches the 4-week gastric mucosal turnover cycle. Week 8, stool regularity, you may not have had since your 40s. Butyrate stabilizing the tight junctions. Microbiome adapted, week, 2 bloating resolved, gut barrier steady, weekly cost, $5.40. Yearly, about $280 less than 1 month of a brand name PPI plus metformin, plus low-dose statin combination at full retail in the United States. Subscribe so the next one finds you on Tuesday. Pinned comment summary, 5 lines. 1 note before I close. The 3 foods I walk tonight sit inside a longer document I keep. The blue zone, body reset. It covers all 5 zones across 90 days, with the bitter mitigation step for goya already worked into the recipes that need it, and a 4-week cooking club calendar for the moai problem I described. The 3 foods stand on their own. The document is what the colleagues who ask me for the cohort notes usually receive. 1. Half a goya bitter melon every other day. Salt rested 10 minutes, then blanched. 30 sec before stir fry. 2. A small handful of yomogi Japanese mugwort, Korean suk 2-3 times a week, fresh in spring or dried tea aisle year-round. 3. 50 g of gobo burdock root every other day, scrubbed, but not peeled, shaved into matchsticks, kinpira style. 4. The bowl, goya, yomogi, gobo champuru, 25 minutes, $3.20 per serving, 2 servings per recipe. 5. 3 organs pancreas, stomach lining, gut barrier quietly regulated for 80 years. That is what we found across 500 Okinawans who lived past 100. Kame Ogito's vine is still climbing the trellis behind the coral stone house in Ogimi. Toguchi's yomogi comes back every March without anyone planting it. Yamashiro's hedge of burdock keeps producing roots that her granddaughter now digs up with the same small hand spade. 3 bowls. 3 organs. 80 years. One last thing before the video ends. When I was leaving Ogito's house on the last visit, she handed me a single small goya she had picked that morning. She did not say much. She placed it in my palm, closed my fingers around it, and patted the back of my hand. I remember the weight. About 150 grams, give or take. The exact weight of 1 small bitter melon in a bowl of champuru for 2 people. I have never forgotten it. That is the paper. That is what we found.